Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon, before the names of pharaohs were etched into stone, there was a civilization so old that even ancient Egypt considered it part of their distant past. Picture a people who mastered agriculture, built monumental structures, and laid the groundwork for human civilization, yet vanished without a single name to remember them by. This is the mystery we're about to explore, the enigmatic culture that flourished along the Nile long before dynasties rose and fell, a society so influential that its echoes can still be felt today, buried beneath layers of sand and time. What if everything we think we know about the origins of civilization is missing a crucial chapter? Archaeologists have uncovered tantalizing clues, strange artifacts, unexplained ruins, and fragments of a language no one can decipher, all pointing to a sophisticated society that predates recorded history. These weren't primitive tribes, they were innovators, architects of a world that would one day inspire the pharaohs themselves. Yet their story was swallowed by the ages, leaving behind only whispers in the wind and questions that defy easy answers. Why does this forgotten civilization matter? Because it challenges our understanding of human progress. It forces us to ask how much of our history has been lost. What legacies have slipped through the cracks of time? This video isn't just about dust and ruins, it's about rediscovering a piece of ourselves, a lineage of ingenuity and resilience that shaped the course of humanity. From cryptic symbols etched into pottery to the alignment of ancient megaliths with celestial patterns, every clue is a thread in a tapestry waiting to be woven. So let's begin this journey together, peeling back the layers of myth and science to uncover the truth about the civilization that left no name. The fertile banks of the Nile held secrets long before the first stone of Giza was laid. Imagine a time when the great river's annual floods weren't just a natural phenomenon, but the lifeblood of an entire civilization, one that learned to harness its power centuries before the pharaohs ruled. These forgotten pioneers didn't just survive along the Nile, they thrived, transforming wild grasses into cultivated crops and turning scattered villages into organized communities. Their innovations laid the very foundation of what we now call civilization. Archaeological digs have revealed something extraordinary: polished stone tools, far more refined than expected for their age, pottery decorated with intricate patterns that suggest symbolic thinking, and burial sites arranged with deliberate care. These aren't the haphazard traces of primitive hunter-gatherers, but the marks of a society with shared rituals, specialized labor, and perhaps even early forms of trade. At sites like Nabta Playa and Merimd Bini Salama, researchers have uncovered circular stone arrangements that align with celestial events, hinting at a sophisticated understanding of astronomy that predates the pyramids by thousands of years. What's most fascinating isn't just what they built, but what they passed down. Many of the agricultural techniques later used by the Egyptians, crop rotation, irrigation channels, grain storage, appear to have roots in this earlier culture. Even some religious symbols found in pharaonic temples bear striking resemblances to much older artifacts. It's as if the foundation of Egyptian greatness was laid by hands whose names we'll never know. Yet the greatest mystery isn't their achievements, but their disappearance. Climate shifts may have forced them to adapt or migrate, their knowledge carried forward by descendants who would one day build the monuments we recognize today. The sand that once buried their settlements now guards their stories, leaving us to wonder how many other chapters of human history remain hidden, waiting to rewrite what we thought we knew. The story of pre-dynastic Egypt isn't one of simple beginnings, but of a society already pulsing with complexity. Along the Nile's winding banks, villages grew into towns, and towns into regional centers, each with its own distinct identity, yet connected by a shared cultural fabric. Take the Nakata culture, for example. Their pottery alone tells a vivid story. Delicate vessels painted with hippos, boats, and hunting scenes weren't just utilitarian objects. They were canvases displaying a world where nature and the supernatural intertwined. These designs didn't merely decorate homes, they likely played roles in rituals, hinting at beliefs that would later evolve into Egypt's formal religion. What's remarkable is how these communities stretched far beyond their immediate surroundings. Seashells from the Red Sea, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and obsidian from distant volcanic regions have all been found in pre-dynastic graves. This wasn't accidental. It reveals networks of trade reaching hundreds of miles, challenging the idea that early societies were isolated. Some scholars believe these exchanges weren't just about goods, but ideas, with craftsmen and traders acting as conduits for cultural exchange long before empires rose. Burial sites offer perhaps the clearest window into this forgotten world. Unlike the uniform graves of earlier periods, pre-dynastic tombs show striking variations. Some bodies curled in fetal positions surrounded by pots, others laid flat with prized possessions like ivory figurines or finely crafted knives. This diversity suggests a society where status and beliefs were already shaping how people honored their dead. At Hierarchical, one extraordinary grave held a man buried with what appears to be early royal regalia, a precursor to the pharaonic tradition that would follow. Then there's the puzzle of early writing. Scratched onto pottery and carved into ceremonial palettes, proto-hieroglyphs appear as far back as 3300 BCE. These weren't random marks, but a system in its infancy, some symbols representing objects, others possibly conveying sounds or concepts. It's as if we're watching the very moment when spoken language began its transformation into recorded history. The true genius of these pre-dynastic cultures lies in their adaptability. When the Nile's floods were unpredictable, they developed water management techniques. When resources were scarce, they established trade routes, and when death came, they crafted rituals that gave meaning to life's impermanence. Their legacy wasn't erased by the rise of the pharaohs. It was absorbed, refined, and magnified, becoming the hidden foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations would stand. Among the scattered remnants of Egypt's earliest civilizations, the Naqada culture stands out like a vivid brushstroke across the canvas of prehistory. Their legacy isn't written in grand monuments or royal decrees, but in the quiet eloquence of everyday objects, pottery shards, stone tools, and grave goods that whisper secrets across 7,000 years. What makes the Nakata so extraordinary isn't just their craftsmanship, but how their artifacts reveal a society in transition, straddling the line between primal survival and the dawn of complex culture. Take their iconic pottery, for instance. These aren't crude vessels made purely for function. Nakata artisans painted their ceramics with swirling patterns, animal figures, and scenes that seem to dance between reality and symbolism. A single jar might feature sleek boats with multiple oars, not just a decorative motif, but possibly a nod to the Nile's central role in trade and transportation. Other pots depict strange, otherworldly creatures with elongated limbs, hinting at a rich spiritual life where the boundaries between human and divine were already beginning to blur. These designs weren't random, they were a visual language, one that would eventually evolve into the hieroglyphs of dynastic Egypt. But the Nakata's innovations went far beyond ceramics. In their burial sites, archaeologists have uncovered flint knives of astonishing precision, blades so finely crafted they could rival modern surgical steel. Some graves contain pallets for grinding minerals, likely used for body paint or early cosmetics, suggesting rituals of adornment that transcended mere vanity. Then there are the mace heads, polished stone weapons that may have been symbols of authority long before the pharaohs wielded their scepters. Each artifact is a puzzle piece, revealing a society where skill and symbolism were deeply intertwined. What's truly striking is the scale of their influence. Nakada-style pottery has been found far beyond their heartland in Upper Egypt, reaching into Lower Egypt and even distant Nubia. This wasn't just cultural diffusion, it was evidence of a network that connected disparate regions through trade, migration, or perhaps even early forms of diplomacy. Some scholars speculate that the Nakada weren't just one culture among many, but a catalyst, absorbing ideas from neighbors and refining them into something new. The greatest mystery, though, lies in what came next. Around 3200 BCE, Nakada settlements show signs of dramatic change: walls built for defense, graves with increasingly unequal wealth, and the earliest hints of centralized power. It's as if we're witnessing the birth pangs of a state, the moment when scattered villages began coalescing into something resembling a kingdom. Were the Nakada the architects of Egypt's first dynasty? We may never know for certain, but their fingerprints are everywhere in the art, the tools, and perhaps even the political structures that would one day unite the Nile under the rule of the pharaohs. To study the Nakada is to walk a tightrope between archaeology and imagination. Their world left no written records, no king lists or royal proclamations. Yet in the curve of a painted pot or the edge of a flint blade, we catch glimpses of a people who planted the seeds for one of history's most enduring civilizations. They remind us that greatness rarely emerges from nowhere. It's built layer by layer, innovation by innovation, by hands whose names time has erased but whose legacy endures. Imagine a world without maps, without currency, without even written contracts, yet where goods traveled thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and seas. This was the reality for those early Nile dwellers, whose trade networks wove together distant lands long before the concept of empires existed. Far from isolated villages, they were participants in an economic web stretching from the turquoise mines of Sinai to the ebony forests of Nubia, moving not just materials but ideas that would shape civilizations for millennia. The evidence lies buried in the artifacts themselves. At pre-dynastic sites like Abydos, archaeologists have uncovered obsidian blades traced to Ethiopian highlands through chemical fingerprinting, a volcanic glass sharper than steel, traded hand to hand across hundreds of miles. Shells from the Red Sea appear in graves along the Nile's western banks, while Nubian gold ornaments surface in delta settlements. These weren't chance finds, they reveal deliberate, sustained exchange. Without written records, how did such complex trade function? The answer may lie in something as simple as trust. Small, standardized weights found at key sites suggest early forms of measurement, allowing disparate cultures to barter fairly. Shared artistic motifs on pottery across regions hint at established relationships, where repeated interactions turned strangers into trading partners. What's truly groundbreaking is the scale of their connections. Recent excavations at Wadi el-Hudi uncovered ancient amethyst mines where workers left behind pottery bearing designs from both Upper Egypt and the Levant, proof that these routes reached beyond Africa. Some theorize that donkey caravans, those unsung heroes of early commerce, moved goods along desert tracks later used by pharaonic expeditions. Others point to reed boats navigating the Nile and Red Sea, carrying cargoes of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or olive oil from Canaan. But trade wasn't just about luxury items. The exchange of practical knowledge may have been their greatest legacy. Flint working techniques from the eastern desert appear suddenly in Nile villages, while Nubian pottery styles influence Egyptian designs. This cross-pollination of skills accelerated innovation, turning regional specialties into shared advancements. A single obsidian blade might represent not just a tool, but the transfer of metallurgical insights that would eventually lead to copper smelting. The disappearance of these networks holds clues too. Climate shifts around 3,300 BCE altered trade routes, forcing adaptations that may have spurred the first centralized governments. When resources grew scarce, the ability to organize large-scale trade became a survival skill, one that likely paved the way for Egypt's eventual unification. The silent stones and scattered artifacts tell a story of interdependence, reminding us that even the mightiest civilizations grew from humble exchanges between people who never knew their place in history. The pyramids may dominate our imagination of ancient Egypt, but their grandeur didn't emerge from nothing. Centuries before stone blocks were precisely stacked toward the heavens, humbler structures rose along the Nile buildings that tell a quieter but no less revolutionary story. At Hierarchical, archaeologists have uncovered something extraordinary, a ceremonial enclosure dating back to 3,500 BCE, its walls made of wooden posts and reed mats plastered with mud. This wasn't just shelter, it was a sacred space where rituals unfolded under the watchful eyes of unseen deities. The design is startlingly sophisticated, an oval courtyard with niches that eerily foreshadow the inner sanctuaries of later Egyptian temples. Mudbrick homes from this era reveal equally ingenious adaptations. Unlike the temporary huts of earlier periods, these were permanent dwellings with multiple rooms, storage areas, and even early forms of ventilation. At Merimd Bini Salama, entire neighborhoods have been mapped, showing houses clustered around shared courtyards, a blueprint for community living that would endure for millennia. The bricks themselves tell a tale of experimentation, some mixed with straw for strength, others smoothed with clay plaster that still bears the fingerprints of their makers. Then there are the enigmatic mastaba precursors, low, rectangular tombs built of mud brick that would eventually evolve into the stepped pyramids of Djoser's era. At sites like Nakada and Abydos, these early burial structures feature internal chambers and false doors, spiritual thresholds where the living could commune with the dead. The most striking examples are adorned with recessed niches, a design element that later appeared in royal tombs as the iconic palace facade motif. Perhaps the most tantalizing clues come from the quarries themselves. Far from the Nile's floodplain, in the eastern desert, ancient workers left behind stone vessels and tools near extraction sites. These weren't crude implements. They were precision instruments used to hollow out bowls from hard basalt, a technique requiring generations of accumulated knowledge. Some unfinished vessels bear chisel marks showing exactly how these artisans worked, millimeter by millimeter, to create objects of both utility and beauty. The true genius of pre-pyramid architecture lies in its adaptability. When wood was scarce, they used bundled reeds. When floods threatened, they built on mounds. Every solution was a stepping stone toward greater mastery of materials and space. By the time the first pyramid rose at Saqqara, Egypt's builders had already spent centuries honing their craft in mud and stone, proof that history's most iconic monuments stand on foundations we're only beginning to uncover. A hippo charges through reeds, its bulky form rendered in swift ochre strokes across a pottery shard. A boat glides atop zigzagging lines that might represent water, its crew raising tools toward a sun disk. These aren't mere decorations, they're fragments of a lost language, one spoken not with words but with images. Pre-dynastic art bursts with symbols that scholars now realize were far more than aesthetic choices. Every curve and dot held meaning, encoding beliefs about life, death, and the natural world in ways we're only beginning to decipher. Take the recurring image of the wild bull, its horns curving like crescent moons across countless artifacts. In later Egyptian culture, bulls symbolized power and fertility, but their prominence in pre-dynastic art suggests these associations ran far deeper. Some vessels show bulls pierced by arrows, possibly representing hunting rituals or spiritual sacrifices. Other designs feature herds moving in procession, perhaps echoing early creation myths where animals played central roles. Then there are the enigmatic, dancing figures painted on Nakata Roman II pottery, stick-limbed humans with raised arms frozen mid-motion. Are these celebrants in a religious ceremony, ancestral spirits? Without written records, each interpretation opens new doors into their worldview. The materials themselves tell another story. Pigments weren't chosen randomly. Red ochre from desert mines evoked life and vitality, while black from charcoal may have symbolized the fertile Nile silt. Even the pottery shapes carried meaning. Beakers with narrow necks found in graves might have held offerings meant to nourish the dead, their constricted openings symbolizing the transition between worlds. Some vessels bear wavy handles that mimic rope bindings, possibly echoing containers used in rituals where contents were ceremonially sealed. Rock carvings add another layer to this visual lexicon. At sites like Jebel el Silsila, prehistoric artists pecked images of giraffes, boats, and strange hybrid creatures into cliff faces. Some scenes show hunters surrounding animals with nets, not just records of survival, but perhaps early attempts to harness spiritual power through imagery. A particularly striking tableau depicts what looks like a ceremonial procession, with figures carrying standards topped with animal shapes. These could be ancestors of the totems later carried in pharaonic festivals. Perhaps most intriguing are the geometric patterns that appear alongside figurative art. Zigzags resembling water, concentric circles that might represent celestial bodies, checkerboard grids evocative of fields. These abstract designs likely held symbolic weight. Some scholars see in them the roots of hieroglyphic writing, where simple shapes eventually evolved into phonetic signs. A single Nakada Roman III pot might combine all these elements, a crocodile swimming through wavy lines below a row of triangles representing mountains, creating a narrative about the journey between earthly and divine realms. The true power of this art lies in its continuity. Many symbols found on pre-dynastic artifacts reappear millennia later in formal Egyptian iconography: the falcon, the serpent, the solar disk. It's as if the foundational myths of pharaonic civilization were first sketched in these early images, passed down through generations like a visual whisper. When we study these ancient designs, we're not just looking at artifacts, we're glimpsing the moment when humanity first tried to pin the ineffable to the page, to make the unseen visible through the silent eloquence of form and color. Burial sites along the Nile reveal far more than bones and dust. They uncover a civilization's deepest fears and highest hopes. In the golden silence of these ancient graves, we find the first stirrings of a concept that would define Egypt for millennia: the belief that death was not an end but a transformation. Pre-dynastic burials show bodies carefully arranged in fetal positions, curled as if ready for rebirth, surrounded by pottery vessels that likely held food and drink for the journey beyond. Some graves contain pallets still stained with pigments, suggesting the dead were sent into the afterlife adorned with sacred colors. The variety of grave goods tells its own story. A single burial might hold flint knives for protection, ivory combs for vanity, and clay figurines whose purpose we can only guess. At one remarkable site in Adama, archaeologists found a child's grave containing a tiny gazelle figurine, a tender offering that transcends time to touch our hearts. These weren't mere possessions buried out of sentiment, they were necessities packed for an eternal voyage. The inclusion of tools and weapons speaks volumes. This was a people who believed the afterlife demanded the same skills and struggles as earthly existence. What's truly striking is how these early practices evolved. In the Nakada Roman II period, graves begin showing social stratification, some burials sparse and simple, others overflowing with exotic imports like lapis lazuli and gold. At Hierarchical, Tomb 100 boasts a wooden chamber, an innovation that foreshadows the sarcophagi of pharaohs. Even the orientation of bodies changed over time, shifting from random placements to consistent alignment with the Nile's flow or celestial patterns, early attempts to connect the deceased with cosmic cycles. The most fascinating link to later Egyptian tradition lies in the emerging cult of the dead. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of funerary feasts, pits filled with animal bones and broken dishes near graves, suggesting ongoing rituals to nourish the departed. This practice would blossom into the elaborate offering cults of dynastic Egypt, where families regularly brought sustenance to their ancestors' tombs. Certain graves even show signs of intentional mummification attempts, with bodies wrapped in linen and treated with resin centuries before the first royal embalmers practiced their art. Yet for all these connections, pre-dynastic beliefs held unique mysteries. Some bodies were buried with heavy stones on their chests or faces, a precaution against restless spirits. Others were interred with hunting dogs at their feet, companions for the afterlife that hint at a bond between humans and animals deeper than mere utility. The presence of female burials with prestigious goods challenges assumptions about early gender roles, while graves containing mismatched sets of artifacts suggest complex trade relationships extending even beyond death. These burial customs form a bridge between worlds, not just between life and afterlife, but between forgotten cultures and the civilization they birthed. Every curled skeleton, every worn amulet, every child's toy placed in the earth was a declaration. Death could not erase a person's place in the community. This unshakable conviction would echo through the ages, finding its ultimate expression in the pyramids' monuments built by descendants who still believed, as their ancestors had, that memory could conquer oblivion. Among the most provocative discoveries from pre-dynastic Egypt are the numerous female figurines that defy simplistic interpretation. These clay and ivory statuettes, often called Naqada goddesses, depict women with exaggerated hips, pronounced breasts, and sometimes elaborate headdresses. Far from passive fertility symbols, they radiate authority and presence. At sites like Badari and Mostajida, these figures appear in both graves and domestic contexts, suggesting roles that bridge the earthly and divine. Some scholars argue they represent early deities, perhaps precursors to later goddesses like Hathor or Isis. Others see them as symbols of clan matriarchs or ritual specialists whose influence permeated daily life. Burial customs reinforce this picture of female prominence. In cemeteries dating back to 4500 BCE, women's graves often contain prestige items equal to or surpassing those of men: polished stone palettes, exotic beads, and ceremonial blades. One extraordinary tomb at Hierarchical held a woman buried with an ivory scepter, her body surrounded by jars that once held precious oils. Such finds hint at a social structure where status wasn't strictly tied to gender, but to individual achievement or spiritual role. Even more telling are the rare double burials, where couples were interred together with equal grave goods, a stark contrast to later periods when wives were often buried as afterthoughts in their husbands' tombs. The archaeological record also whispers of women's economic power. Impressions from cylinder seals, early administrative tools, sometimes show female figures overseeing grain distribution or textile production. At Merimd Bini Salama, clay figurines of women grinding grain suggest this vital task held ceremonial significance, blending daily labor with sacred duty. Unlike later Egyptian art that idealized domestic scenes, these early depictions show women engaged in community leadership, their hands shaping not just bread but the social order itself. Perhaps most revolutionary is what's missing: no evidence of seclusion or restricted movement. Pre-dynastic art frequently shows women alongside men in hunting parties, ritual dances, and river processions. The famous painted tomb at Hierarchical depicts a scene once assumed to show only male warriors until closer inspection revealed female figures wielding throw sticks alongside them. This challenges the long-held assumption that ancient gender roles were universally rigid from the start. The transition to dynastic rule brought subtle but seismic shifts. Female figurines grow rarer, their forms becoming more stylized and less powerful. Royal iconography begins emphasizing male gods and kings, while elite women's roles narrow to supportive positions like Priestess of Hathor. Yet echoes of that earlier equality persist in the title, Great Royal Wife, that wielded real political power, in the persistence of goddess worship, and in the legal rights Egyptian women retained compared to other ancient cultures. These pre-dynastic artifacts force us to reconsider not just ancient history, but the very narrative of human social evolution. They suggest that gender hierarchies weren't inevitable, but developed in response to specific pressures: population growth, resource competition, or the centralization of power. In their delicate clay faces and richly adorned graves, we glimpse a world of possibilities where the Nile's first builders measured a person's worth not by their sex, but by their contribution to the community's survival and spirit. The story of civilization's birth isn't written in stone or gold. It's etched into the very soil along the Nile. Long before pharaohs ruled, an agricultural revolution quietly unfolded, turning unpredictable floodplains into the world's first breadbasket. These early farmers didn't just adapt to their environment, they engineered it, domesticating wild grasses into emmer wheat and barley crops that would become staples for millennia. Archaeologists have uncovered grinding stones stained with ancient grain residue, silent witnesses to the daily labor that transformed nomadic bands into settled communities. What made their farming so revolutionary wasn't just what they grew, but how they grew it. The Nile's annual floods deposited rich silt across its banks, but these pioneers went beyond passive reliance on nature's generosity. At sites like Fayum and Merimd Bini Salama, researchers have found evidence of early irrigation, simple ditches channeling floodwaters to fields, an innovation that turned seasonal abundance into year-round security. Even more impressive are the underground grain silos discovered at Nabta, circular pits lined with clay to protect harvests from rodents and moisture. These weren't just storage facilities, they were the first banks where surplus crops became a form of wealth and insurance against lean years. The tools they developed reveal a society constantly innovating. Flint-bladed sickles with curved wooden handles allowed efficient harvesting, while polished stone hoes broke up soil for planting. Some burial sites contain models of granaries placed beside the deceased, perhaps ensuring the departed would never hunger in the afterlife. This profound connection between agriculture and spirituality hints at how deeply farming shaped their worldview. Perhaps most remarkably, their agricultural calendars synchronized with celestial events. The helical rising of Sirius, the Nile's flood cycles, and planting seasons formed an intricate dance of observation and timing. Petroglyphs near Jebel el Silsila may depict early attempts to track these patterns, showing that farming wasn't just manual labor. It required sophisticated understanding of astronomy and meteorology. The true measure of their success lies in what followed. As crop yields stabilized, populations grew, villages expanded, crafts specialized, and for the first time, not everyone needed to work the land. This agricultural surplus created space for artists, potters, and eventually the scribes who would record history. Every pyramid that rose millennia later stood atop this foundation, not of stone, but of countless seasons of sown seeds and carefully tended earth. The forgotten farmers of pre-dynastic Egypt didn't just feed bodies, they cultivated the very idea of civilization itself. The flint knives found in pre-dynastic graves aren't just sharp, they're masterpieces of Stone Age engineering, their edges so finely pressure-flaked they could still slice through leather today. This wasn't crude survival technology, it was the cutting edge of its era, literally. Craftsmen spent hours carefully striking stone to create symmetrical blades, some with serrated edges for sawing wood or butchering game. At sites like Abydos, archaeologists have uncovered workshops where generations of artisans perfected their techniques, passing down knowledge through demonstration rather than written manuals. The sheer variety of tools astonishes: scrapers for hides, borers for drilling beads, even delicate microblades for precision work. These weren't general-purpose implements, but specialized instruments revealing a society that valued expertise and efficiency. What's truly revolutionary is how quickly these early Egyptians embraced new materials. Around 3600 BC, copper begins appearing in graves, not as crude lumps, but as intricately rolled beads and finely tapered needles. The process of cold hammering native copper into shape represented a monumental cognitive leap, understanding that certain stones could be transformed through persistent effort. By the Nakada Roman II period, they'd progressed to smelting, using simple pit furnaces to extract copper from malachite ore at temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. Crucibles found at Modi show residues of advanced alloying experiments, mixing copper with arsenic to create harder, more durable tools. This wasn't just metallurgy, it was early materials science. Equally impressive were their textile innovations. Clay spindle walls and loom weights tell a story of fabric production on an industrial scale. At Badari, excavations revealed flax fibers so finely woven they rival modern linen thread counts. Some burial shrouds show complex twill patterns, proving these early weavers had moved beyond simple plain weave into advanced textile structures. The implications are staggering. This level of cloth production required organized farming of flax, retting ponds to process fibers, and specialized labor divisions. A single garment represented an entire supply chain, from field to finished product. Then there's the mystery of their stone vessels. How did they hollow out solid diorite or basalt, some of Earth's hardest stones, without metal tools? Experiments using reproduced copper drills with abrasive sand show it's possible, but the time investment per vessel would have been enormous. The fact that hundreds survive suggests these weren't utilitarian objects, but prestige items demonstrating a craftsman's patience and skill. Many feature walls thin as eggshells, their interiors polished to a mirror finish. Some even mimic the shapes of earlier basketry, preserving organic traditions in enduring stone. Perhaps their least celebrated but most impactful invention was the humble mudbrick. By mixing Nile silt with straw and baking it in the sun, they created a building material that could withstand floods while being endlessly renewable. The standardization of brick sizes across Upper Egypt hints at early attempts at modular construction, allowing communities to collaborate on large projects. At Buto, archaeologists found bricks stamped with distinctive marks, possibly an early quality control system or maker's signature. these technological leaps didn't happen in isolation. Trade networks brought new ideas from Mesopotamia and the Levant, while local challenges spurred creative solutions. When desertification reduced access to quality flint, they developed copper tools. When population growth demanded more housing, they refined brick-making. Every innovation addressed immediate needs while laying foundations for future advancements. The pyramids and temples of dynastic Egypt didn't emerge from a vacuum. They stood atop centuries of accumulated knowledge, trial and error, and the quiet brilliance of nameless inventors whose legacy is written not in papyrus, but in the enduring artifacts they left behind. Deep in the deserts of southern Egypt, the stone circles of Nabta stand as silent witnesses to humanity's oldest dialogue with the divine. These carefully arranged megaliths, some weighing several tons, aren't mere markers of time. They're the physical remnants of a spiritual revolution. When ancient herders aligned these stones with the summer solstice sunrise and the brightest stars over 7,000 years ago, they weren't just tracking seasons, they were mapping the sacred patterns of the universe itself. The same cosmic forces that guided their livestock to water became manifestations of something greater, early deities taking form not as statues, but as celestial movements and natural phenomena. This connection between earth and sky finds echoes across pre-dynastic sites. At Hierarchical, archaeologists uncovered a ceremonial palette depicting hybrid creatures, part human, part animal, emerging from what appears to be a swirling cosmos. Nearby, pottery fragments show boats carrying strange figures beneath star patterns, possibly representing soul journeys or deities navigating the heavens. Unlike the formalized gods of later Egypt, these early spiritual concepts seem fluid, with powers shifting between animals, elements, and celestial bodies depending on context. A hippopotamus might represent the Nile's destructive floods in one scene, then transform into a protective maternal figure in another. Ritual objects reveal how deeply spirituality permeated daily life. Cosmetic palettes excavated from graves show traces of green malachite and black galena minerals ground not just for adornment, but likely for ceremonial body painting. Some wear patterns suggesting repeated use in rituals before being buried with their owners. At El Amra, a cache of ivory figurines was found arranged in what appears to be a ritual tableau, their exaggerated features emphasizing fertility and abundance. These weren't passive idols, but active participants in ceremonies that may have involved dance, chanting, or communal feasting. The most striking evidence comes from animal burials. At Adama, a cemetery contained dogs interred with the same care as humans, their bodies curled in sleeping positions beside food offerings. Nearby, a baboon was buried with a collection of polished pebbles, perhaps tools for divination. This reverence for animals predates the zoomorphic gods of dynastic Egypt by centuries, suggesting the roots of Sobek, the crocodile god, or Bastet, the cat goddess, grew from these early practices. What emerges is a spirituality inseparable from survival. Rain dances weren't superstition, but necessary appeals to unseen forces governing crops and floods. Hunting rituals honored the spirits of prey animals while ensuring future abundance. Even their earliest attempts at mummification, using linen and tree resins to preserve bodies, may have sprung from observing how arid soils naturally conserved the dead. Every innovation in religion was also an experiment in living harmoniously with an unpredictable world. The transition to formalized worship happened gradually. At Nakada, a temple precinct dating to 3500 BCE shows the first traces of architectural spaces dedicated solely to ritual, a sacred enclosure that would evolve into the temple complexes of Thebes and Memphis. The gods were becoming more defined, their attributes crystallizing into the familiar forms of Horus and Isis. Yet the old connections remained. The sky still arched like the goddess Nut's body. The Nile's floods still echoed the tears of the distant Osiris. When we stand beneath the towering columns of Karnak or gaze at the Book of the Dead's intricate spells, we're seeing the flowering of a spiritual tradition that began with desert herders watching the stars. Their rituals may have been simple offerings of grain, dances around fires, stories told of the lioness in the moon, but in these acts, they planted the seeds of one of history's most enduring religious systems. The great irony is that while the pharaohs built monuments to ensure their names would never die, it was these nameless ancestors who truly achieved immortality, their beliefs outlasting empires, encoded in hymns and hieroglyphs they could never have imagined. Scratched into the surface of a 5,000-year-old pottery shard, a series of strokes forms what looks like a bird in flight, not a random doodle, but possibly one of humanity's first attempts to pin language to permanence. These enigmatic symbols found on artifacts across pre-dynastic Egypt represent a puzzle that has linguists and archaeologists locked in passionate debate. Are we looking at early accounting marks, ritual symbols, or the birth pangs of true writing? The answer could rewrite our understanding of how civilization codified its thoughts. Take the ceramic vessels of Nakata Roman III, their surfaces adorned with repeated motifs, looping lines that resemble water, circles that might denote grain measures, and stylized animals that recur like signatures. Unlike later hieroglyphs with standardized forms, these symbols vary wildly between regions, suggesting they were personal or local in meaning. Some jars bear single marks near their bases, possibly indicating contents or ownership. Others display sequences that hint at narratives: a boat followed by a mountain, then a cluster of dots, as if recounting a journey across the desert to a specific destination. The most compelling examples come from Tomb Uj at Abydos, where bone and ivory tags attached to grave goods feature clusters of symbols that some scholars argue represent early phonetic signs, a bridge between abstract marks and true writing. The controversy lies in interpretation. Some researchers, like German archaeologist Gunter Dreher, see these tags as a developed system, each symbol corresponding to specific sounds or words, making them a direct precursor to hieroglyphs. Others counter that without clear syntactic rules or contextual evidence, they could just as easily be mnemonic devices, like a shopper's list of images to jog memory rather than convey specific language. What's undeniable is their sophistication. Unlike simple tally marks counting livestock, these symbols demonstrate an ability to think in abstractions, to let a drawn ox represent not just the animal, but perhaps the concept of wealth, a family lineage, or even a divine offering. Parallels elsewhere deepen the mystery. In Mesopotamia, clay tokens used for accounting evolved into cuneiform over centuries. Could Egypt's proto-writing have followed a similar path? The Jebel el-Arak knife handle, carved with intricate scenes of conflict and ritual, bears markings that some compare to early Sumerian signs, raising questions about cultural exchange. Yet Egypt's symbols feel distinctly local, rooted in Nile Valley imagery like crocodiles and papyrus stalks, suggesting independent development. The most tantalizing clue comes from the Narmer palette, that iconic slab celebrating Egypt's unification around 3100 BCE. Amid scenes of conquest, tiny hieroglyphs name places and people, proof that by this point writing had matured. But the palette also features older, cruder symbols alongside these polished signs, like a museum of writing's evolution carved in stone. It's as if the artist intentionally juxtaposed ancestral marks with their refined descendants, honoring the long road from simple scratches to recorded history. What these proto-symbols reveal isn't just about linguistics but cognition. When a potter incised a bird onto wet clay, they were doing more than decorating, they were externalizing thought, taking the first steps toward separating ideas from the moment of their conception. That leap from ephemeral speech to enduring record may be the silent revolution that made everything else, laws, literature, even the names of pharaohs, possible. The irony is rich. A civilization famed for its meticulous records may have left us just enough clues to glimpse its own illiterate infancy, but not quite enough to hear its first written whispers clearly. Beneath the golden sands of pre-dynastic Egypt lie not just tools and pottery, but silent testimonies of a society in flux, where cooperation and conflict walked hand in hand. At sites like Hierarchies and Nakata, archaeologists have uncovered something startling: thick mudbrick walls encircling settlements, some reinforced with wooden palisades. These weren't merely boundaries to keep out wildlife. They were fortifications, evidence that danger loomed beyond the safety of village fires. Inside these walls, another discovery hints at rising tensions: caches of expertly crafted weapons, from pear-shaped mace heads capable of crushing skulls to flint-tipped arrows designed for piercing hide shields. What sparked this shift toward organized violence? The answer may lie in the changing landscape itself. Around 3500 BCE, climate fluctuations began altering the Nile's predictable rhythms. As rainfall patterns shifted and fertile lands contracted, communities that once thrived side by side found themselves competing for dwindling resources. At Adama, a mass grave reveals the grim consequences: skeletons bearing deep axe wounds and projectile injuries, some showing signs of healed trauma from earlier conflicts. This wasn't random skirmishing, but sustained warfare over control of water access and arable land. Yet even as conflict flared, cooperation flourished in unexpected ways. The same settlements with defensive walls also yielded artifacts proving extensive trade networks: Nubian gold in Delta graves, Levantine pottery in Upper Egyptian homes. How did these paradoxes coexist? Tribal alliances likely played a key role. At Jebel el-Arak, an ivory knife handle depicts a scene scholars once interpreted purely as battle. But closer inspection reveals figures shaking hands beneath ceremonial standards, suggesting diplomacy might have been as vital as warfare. The most fascinating evidence comes from burial patterns. In some regions, cemeteries show groups buried with distinct weapon styles: curved knives here, straight daggers there, implying different cultural identities. Yet these same graves contain identical pottery designs and imported goods, proving that even rival groups participated in shared economic systems. It's a dynamic we recognize today. Nations that trade together may still clash over borders, their relationships layered with both competition and mutual dependence. This duality reached its climax in the period just before unification. Fortified towns like this and Thinis emerged as power centers, their leaders likely negotiating complex webs of allegiance and rivalry. Some scholars believe the famous Narmer palette, showing a king smiting his enemies, commemorates not just a single battle but the culmination of centuries of social evolution where conflict and cooperation finally coalesced into centralized rule. The palette's reverse side hints at this balance. Beneath the warlike imagery, intertwined serpent-necked creatures symbolize the unification of opposing forces. What makes this era so pivotal is how it mirrors civilization's broader story. From the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, early societies faced the same crucible: scarcity breeding conflict, but interdependence necessitating cooperation. Along the Nile, this tension forged innovations in governance, from conflict resolution to resource distribution, that would enable Egypt's golden age. The walls that once divided villages became foundations for temples, The weapons that took lives were melted into tools that sustained them. In the end, the civilization that left no name taught us a timeless lesson. Progress isn't born from peace or war alone, but from the fragile equilibrium between the two. The Nile's heartbeat dictated the rhythm of life for these ancient people. Its annual floods not just a seasonal event, but the very pulse of their civilization. Unlike the unpredictable rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile followed a remarkably consistent cycle, swelling with summer rains from Ethiopian highlands, spreading fertile black silt across its floodplain, then retreating to leave behind soil so rich it could yield 3 harvests a year. This natural irrigation system created an agricultural paradise, but it wasn't foolproof. Core samples drilled from the riverbed tell a dramatic story, layers of thick sediment alternating with thin, drought-stricken bands that correspond to periods of famine and upheaval in the archaeological record. One particularly severe dry spell around 3800 BC forced radical adaptations. At Nabta Playa, a once thriving pastoral site in what's now the hyper-arid Sahara, stone circles and wells were abruptly abandoned as grasslands turned to dust. But this wasn't wholesale collapse, it was strategic retreat. Pollen analysis shows these herders didn't vanish. They migrated toward the Nile, bringing knowledge of desert-adapted crops like drought-resistant barley to merge with floodplain farming techniques. The result, an agricultural revolution that combined the reliability of river irrigation with hardy cereals bred for survival. The landscape itself became their greatest teacher. When floods grew erratic during the Nakata Roman II period, they engineered the first basin irrigation systems, networks of earthen dikes that trapped and slowly released floodwaters. At El Omri, archaeologists have traced these early hydraulic works, showing how communities transformed passive reliance on nature into active water management. Even their calendar reflected this environmental intelligence, dividing the year into 3 seasons based on the Nile's behavior: Ak-hit inundation, Peret growth, and Shemu harvest, a system so practical it endured for millennia. Animal bones from settlement sites reveal another ingenious adaptation. During lean years, the proportion of wild game in diets spiked dramatically, showing how these communities fluidly shifted between farming, herding, and hunting as conditions demanded. At Merimd Bini Salama, storage pits were dug deeper during prosperous years, creating food banks against future scarcity. Some pits show evidence of insect-repelling herbs layered between grain, early pest control techniques born of necessity. Perhaps most remarkably, they turned climate challenges into cultural strengths. The same droughts that tested their survival skills also concentrated populations along the Nile, accelerating social complexity. Scarce resources spurred trade networks that eventually stretched from Nubia to the Levant, while the need to coordinate irrigation projects may have planted seeds of centralized governance. The very hardships that could have destroyed them instead forged innovations in technology, cooperation, and resilience, lessons etched not in stone, but in the enduring patterns of how they lived with, rather than against, their capricious environment. Modern climate scientists studying this period find eerie parallels to today's challenges. Sediment cores show the Nile's floods became more variable right before the unification of Egypt, suggesting environmental stress can catalyze social transformation. The difference, where we rely on technology to dominate nature, these ancient innovators sought balance, building flexible systems that bent without breaking. Their greatest monument wasn't any single structure, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned to read the land like a sacred text, writing their survival in the language of adaptation. A painted pot from Nakata shows figures with arms raised, bodies arched in motion, not frozen in stillness, but captured mid-dance as if the artist could still hear the rhythm that set them in motion 5,000 years ago. Across dozens of pre-dynastic artifacts, these dynamic scenes repeat: processions of clapping figures, groups swaying in unison, lone performers with rattles or streamers. Music and dance weren't mere entertainment for these ancient communities. They were the lifeblood of collective memory, a way to channel joy, grief, and the sacred without relying on written words. Though no intact instruments survive, archaeologists have pieced together clues about their sonic world. Ivory clappers shaped like human hands, some found in graves likely kept time during ceremonies, their sharp clicks echoing like ancient metronomes. Hollow turtle shells with traces of wear suggest they were struck as percussion instruments, while long bones drilled with holes may be early flutes. At El Amra, a pottery shard depicts what looks like a harpist beside dancers, hinting at stringed instruments predating those found in pharaonic tombs. Even the landscape itself may have been part of the performance. Acoustic studies show that rock gongs near burial sites produce resonant tones when struck, possibly used to summon spirits or mark rituals. The contexts where music thrived reveal its cultural weight. Many dancing figures appear on vessels buried with the dead, implying rituals where the living perform to guide souls to the afterlife. At Hierarchical, a wall painting shows women in procession, their white skirts flaring as they move, perhaps part of a fertility rite or harvest celebration. Other scenes depict mixed groups of men and women dancing with interlocked arms, suggesting communal events that strengthened social bonds. Unlike the formalized temple dances of later Egypt, these early performances feel spontaneous, visceral, as essential as breath. Beyond ritual, music likely permeated daily life. Herders may have used bone whistles to direct animals, while fishermen could have sung rhythmic chants to coordinate net casting. Mothers probably hummed lullabies not unlike those sung today, their melodies lost but their purpose eternal. The most tantalizing clue comes from phonetic reconstructions of later Egyptian words. Some linguists believe certain hieroglyphs preserving the names of instruments may echo much older, pre-dynastic terms, like linguistic fossils of a forgotten musical lexicon. What resonates most powerfully isn't the speculation about instruments or scales, but the universality these images convey. A child tapping two stones together, a circle of friends clapping and swaying, a lone voice rising in song. These acts transcend time. When we see those ancient figures frozen mid-dance, we're not just looking at art. We're witnessing the moment when rhythm first became ritual, when sound became a bridge between worlds, and though the songs themselves have vanished, their echoes still ripple through the silence of the ages. The charred remains of ancient bread loaves, preserved for millennia in the ashes of long-cooled ovens, tell a story far richer than simple survival. These early Egyptians didn't just eat, they crafted a cuisine as sophisticated as their tools, turning the Nile's bounty into meals that nourished both body and community. Chemical analysis of pottery shards reveals residues of emmer wheat and barley, ground into flour so fine it could rival modern baking standards. Fish bones stacked in middens show they harvested tilapia and catfish during the Nile's annual inundation, smoking or drying them for leaner months. But their diet wasn't just functional, it was seasonal, diverse, and deeply connected to the rhythms of their world. Examinations of dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, have uncovered microscopic traces of tubers, legumes, and even early varieties of melon. At sites like Fayum, archaeologists found storage pits lined with baskets still holding desiccated figs and dates, their sugars concentrated by time into crystalline sweetness. What emerges isn't the monotonous gruel we might expect, but a rotating menu shaped by nature's calendar. spring greens foraged from riverbanks, summer's ripe fruits, autumn's freshly harvested grains, and winter's preserved meats. Even their beverages left clues. Residues in ceramic vessels suggest fermented drinks made from honey or wild grapes, possibly served in communal rituals. The social dimension of food shines through in burial practices. A child's grave at Adama contained a tiny clay bowl still holding fish bones, placed there by grieving parents 5,000 years ago. Elite tombs featured entire banquets for the afterlife, joints of meat, baskets of bread, and jars of beer, all carefully arranged as if for a feast. At Hierarchical, a ceremonial precinct yielded heaps of cattle bones burned in patterns suggesting large-scale barbecues, where the act of sharing meat reinforced social bonds. These weren't random meals, but carefully orchestrated events where status and solidarity were served alongside sustenance. Their culinary innovations reveal remarkable adaptability. When droughts made farming precarious, they turned to wild resources like papyrus roots and lotus seeds. Ovens found at Merimd show alternating layers of ash and clean clay, evidence they mastered temperature control for baking, roasting, and possibly even brewing. Some pottery bears scorch marks from direct flame, hinting at stews slow-cooked with Nile perch and garlic chives, their aromas wafting through reed-thatched villages. What makes their foodways truly revolutionary is how they prefigured later traditions. The triangular loaves painted on pre-dynastic pots evolved into the ceremonial breads of pharaonic temples. Beer brewing techniques perfected in these early settlements became a national industry. Even their practice of offering food to the dead blossomed into the elaborate funerary cults of dynastic Egypt. In every charred seed and broken pot, we taste the origins of a culinary legacy that would endure for ages, proof that civilization's foundations were built not just on stone, but on the shared labor of sowing, cooking, and breaking bread together. Cattle weren't just livestock to these ancient people, they were living symbols of power and divine favor. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where bulls were buried with the same care as human elites, their horns polished and bodies arranged on reed mats. At Hierarchical, one tomb held a bull interred with a ceremonial mace head placed between its front legs, as if honoring a fallen warrior. This reverence makes sense when you consider how central cattle were to survival. Their milk sustained families, their dung fertilized crops, and their brute strength plowed fields. But the way these animals appear in art suggests something deeper, a spiritual connection. Rock carvings show cattle with exaggerated, crescent-shaped horns framing celestial bodies, hinting they may have embodied lunar deities or served as intermediaries between earth and sky. Hippopotamuses occupied a far more ambivalent space in their worldview. Pottery shards and tomb paintings depict these massive creatures with startling realism, sometimes as fearsome threats with gaping jaws, other times as protective maternal figures. One Nakata Roman II vessel shows a hippo surrounded by tiny spears, possibly representing a hunting ritual where overcoming such a dangerous beast proved a young warrior's courage. Yet in later contexts, female hippos appear cradling calves, their rounded forms echoing fertility figurines. This duality reflects the Nile itself, a life-giver that could also drown the unwary in its unpredictable floods. Birds flutter through pre-dynastic art with striking frequency. A carved ivory knife handle from Abydos portrays herons wading through marsh grasses, their slender necks arched with lifelike grace. These weren't just decorative motifs. Many scholars believe waterbirds symbolized the soul's journey, their ability to traverse air, water, and land mirroring the transition between realms. Falcons appear too, often perched on standards or boat prows, an early glimmer of the god Horus who would dominate Egyptian religion. Even humble geese left their mark, their bones appear in kitchen middens, but also in graves where they may have served as food for the afterlife or guides to the underworld. Then there were the dogs. Unlike later periods when cats dominated, pre-dynastic burials reveal a special bond between humans and canines. At Helwan, a cemetery yielded over a dozen dog graves, some wearing collars of pierced shells. One puppy was buried curled beside a child, their skeletons intertwined as if in sleep. These weren't strays, but valued companions. Their keen senses likely aided in hunting gazelles or guarding settlements from desert predators. Some skeletal remains show healed fractures, proof they were nursed back to health rather than abandoned when injured. The most enigmatic animal depictions defy easy categorization. A palette from Jersey shows serpentine creatures with feline heads, while a linen fragment from Jebelin features a jackal-like beast standing upright. These hybrid figures may represent early attempts to visualize deities or supernatural forces, blending the attributes of multiple animals to convey power beyond nature's limits. What emerges is a worldview where the boundary between human and animal was porous. A successful hunt required understanding prey behavior. Survival meant reading the flight patterns of birds for weather signs. In this intimate dance of dependence and reverence, animals weren't just resources, they were teachers, protectors, and mirrors reflecting humanity's place in a vast, animate world. The cattle that plowed their fields by day might transform into celestial guides by night. The hippos that threatened their boats also embodied the Nile's generative force, and the dogs that slept by their fires became guardians of the eternal dark. The vibrant culture that once thrived along the Nile didn't vanish overnight. It dissolved like a fresco exposed to time's relentless rains, leaving behind only fragments of its former brilliance. One compelling theory points to environmental shifts as the silent assassin. Core samples from the Fayum Depression reveal layers of wind-blown sand interrupting fertile silt deposits around 3200 BCE, marking the onset of prolonged droughts. As the Sahara expanded, grazing lands shrank, forcing herders and farmers into an ever-narrowing strip along the Nile. At sites like Nabta Playa, once bustling settlements show abrupt abandonment, their stone circles left as silent sentinels in what became an uninhabitable desert. But this wasn't a wholesale collapse, it was a strategic retreat. Pollen analysis proves these resilient people adapted, migrating toward the river's lifeblood and merging with riverside communities, their knowledge of desert survival blending with floodplain agriculture to create hardier farming techniques. Another camp of scholars argues for cultural assimilation rather than catastrophe. The artifacts tell a story of gradual transformation. Pre-dynastic pottery, designs slowly incorporating new motifs, burial practices evolving to reflect emerging social hierarchies. At Nakada, excavations reveal layers where distinct regional styles give way to more uniform craftsmanship, suggesting the homogenizing influence of a growing centralized power. Some interpret this as peaceful integration, where local traditions were absorbed into a unifying Egyptian identity. The Nama palette, often hailed as the birth certificate of dynastic Egypt, might actually depict this cultural merger. The intertwined serpents on its reverse side symbolizing not just political union, but the blending of North and South's distinct worldviews. Trade disruptions may have played an equally pivotal role. The collapse of distant partners like Uruk in Mesopotamia around 3100 BC severed access to luxury goods that had fueled elite status. Without lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or silver from Anatolia, local leaders lost their ability to display prestige through exotic imports. At the same time, shifting river channels rendered some strategic trading hubs obsolete. The once thriving port of Buto, for instance, shows signs of economic stagnation as new routes favored emerging power centers. Like dominoes falling, the breakdown of these networks could have destabilized the delicate balance of pre-dynastic society. Then there's the darker possibility of conflict. Mass graves at Adama contain skeletons bearing horrific wounds, skulls crushed by mace blows, arrowheads embedded in vertebrae. Defensive walls suddenly appear around settlements like Hierarchies during the Nakada Roman III period, their thickness speaking to escalating threats. Some researchers propose that the rise of proto-kingdoms led to warfare over dwindling resources, with victors absorbing defeated communities. The famous scorpion macehead, depicting a ruler irrigating fields while captives hang from standards, may memorialize such violent consolidation. Perhaps the most poignant explanation is the simplest: they didn't disappear at all. Their innovations in agriculture became Egypt's breadbasket, their spiritual symbols evolved into hieroglyphs, their reverence for the Nile shaped an entire cosmology. Like a river merging with the sea, their contributions became so fundamental that the source was forgotten. The greatest civilizations aren't always those that leave towering monuments, but those whose ideas become so woven into the fabric of history that we no longer see the threads as separate. Their vanishing act was ultimately an illusion, a transformation so complete that it rendered their name unnecessary, their legacy living on in the very DNA of the culture that followed. The grand temples and pyramids of dynastic Egypt didn't emerge from a vacuum. They stood on foundations laid by hands that history forgot. Look closely at the earliest hieroglyphs, and you'll spot symbols borrowed directly from pre-dynastic pottery. The zigzag lines representing water, the horned bull denoting strength, the falcon embodying divine protection. Even the iconic ankh, that ubiquitous symbol of eternal life, first appeared as a simple knot in Naqada Roman II rock carvings centuries before pharaohs adopted it. This wasn't just artistic coincidence, it was cultural inheritance, a passing of sacred visual language from one era to the next. Dig deeper into religious practices, and the connections grow stronger. The Osiris myth, central to Egyptian theology, mirrors pre-dynastic burial rituals where the deceased were painted green to symbolize rebirth, just as the god of the underworld was depicted with verdant skin. The palettes used to grind eye paint in pre-dynastic graves evolved into the ceremonial cosmetic grinders found in temple treasuries, their function transformed from practical adornment to spiritual purification. Even the practice of mummification shows startling continuity. At Jebelin, a pre-dynastic corpse wrapped in linen and resin predates the first royal mummies by generations, suggesting the pharaoh's embalmers refined existing techniques rather than inventing them. The bureaucratic machinery of dynastic Egypt also bears fingerprints of its predecessors, those small clay tokens found in Naqadan graves. They're nearly identical to the accounting devices used in pharaonic granaries to track shipments. The early cylinder seals that marked property ownership became the official stamps of tax collectors. Most tellingly, the very concept of a centralized state with regional governors answering to a supreme ruler may have roots in the proto-kingdoms that emerged during the Nakada Roman III period, where powerful towns like Nekhen and Thinis began exerting control over surrounding villages. Agricultural innovations proved equally enduring. The basin irrigation systems developed to cope with erratic floods became the backbone of pharaonic farming, enabling the surplus harvests that fed pyramid builders. The solar calendar dividing the year into 3 seasons, still visible on temple walls, was perfected from earlier celestial observations made by desert herders. Even the humble shaduf, that counterbalanced water-lifting device so associated with ancient Egypt, likely originated from pre-dynastic experiments with leverage and weight distribution. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in something intangible, a worldview that saw no sharp divide between past and present. The dynastic Egyptians' reverence for tradition, their belief that proper observance of ancient rites maintained cosmic order, may itself be an inheritance from those nameless ancestors who first painted spirals on pots to represent eternity. When a New Kingdom priest chanted spells from the pyramid texts, he was likely echoing phrases first spoken millennia earlier over simpler graves. The civilization that left no name didn't vanish, it became the silent bedrock upon which one of history's most enduring cultures was built, proving that the mightiest monuments often stand atop foundations we can barely see. Modern archaeology has become a time machine, wielding tools that would seem like magic to the researchers of just a generation ago. Ground-penetrating radar now reveals entire cities sleeping beneath the Saharan sands, their outlines emerging as ghostly grids on computer screens. At a site near Abydos, this technology uncovered a sprawling pre-dynastic settlement with concentric circular dwellings, a layout completely unlike later Egyptian towns, suggesting social structures we're only beginning to comprehend. Meanwhile, magnetometry surveys along vanished Nile tributaries have detected the magnetic signatures of ancient hearths and kilns, mapping trade routes that connected communities across hundreds of miles before the first pyramid stone was cut. The revolution extends beneath the Earth's surface to the microscopic level. DNA analysis of pre-dynastic remains has rewritten migration narratives. A study published in Nature revealed that Nile Valley populations around 4000 BC carried genetic markers linking them to both ancient Levantine farmers and Saharan pastoralists. This genetic mosaic proves the region was a cultural crossroads long before pharaonic unification, with people moving and mixing in ways that challenge old assumptions about isolated civilizations. Even dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, has become a treasure trove, preserving traces of proteins that reveal diets shifting from wild game to domesticated crops, chronicling the agricultural revolution bite by bite. Some of the most startling insights come from residue analysis of seemingly mundane artifacts. A ceramic vessel from Nakata, when examined with mass spectrometry, was found to contain traces of wine with resin additives, evidence of sophisticated fermentation techniques predating known viticulture by centuries. Another pot from Hierarchies yielded chemical signatures of a now extinct plant used in early medicines, its molecular ghosts hinting at lost botanical knowledge. Even the humble ochre pigments on burial shrouds have stories to tell. Isotopic analysis traces their origins to specific desert mines, exposing trade networks stretching deep into what's now the Libyan desert. Perhaps most poignantly, new imaging technologies are giving voices to the voiceless. CT scans of a child's mummy from Jebelin showed not just cause of death, a telltale fracture, but also revealed amulets nestled within the wrappings, invisible to earlier archaeologists. At the Louvre, multispectral imaging recently deciphered faded markings on a pre-dynastic palette, uncovering a procession scene that had been obscured for millennia. These aren't just technical triumphs, they're acts of recovery, piecing together fragments of lives that history nearly erased. The most profound revelation may be how interconnected this ancient world was. Strontium isotope analysis of teeth from Badarian burials indicates some individuals spent childhoods hundreds of miles from their burial sites, while obsidian tools from the eastern desert bear chemical fingerprints matching Ethiopian sources. This evidence paints a picture of dynamic movement and exchange that explodes the myth of static, isolated early cultures. As laser scanning documents eroding rock art and machine learning algorithms cross-reference pottery fragments across continents, archaeology is no longer just about digging, it's about listening. Listening to the faint signals in a tooth's enamel, to the magnetic whispers in the soil, to the genetic echoes in skeletal remains, each technological leap peels back another layer, proving that oblivion is never absolute, not when science can resurrect entire worlds from a grain of sand or a speck of pigment. The civilization that left no name is finally being heard, its story reconstructed not from royal decrees, but from the molecular memories of everyday objects and the quiet testimony of bones that refuse to stay silent. Digging through the layers of pre-dynastic Egypt isn't just about uncovering artifacts, it's about deciphering an academic battleground where every potsherd and bone fragment sparks heated debates. Take the question of social hierarchy. Some scholars point to elaborate tombs like those at Hierarchical as clear evidence of an entrenched elite, where a select few were buried with ivory scepters and exotic imports while others rested with simple parts. But critics argue these differences might reflect ritual roles rather than rigid class systems. Perhaps revered elders or shamans, not kings, occupied those privileged graves. The truth may lie somewhere in between, with status fluid enough to allow mobility based on skill or spiritual authority rather than inherited power. Technological innovation is another flashpoint. Traditional timelines paint a steady progression from stone tools to copper, but recent finds upend this neat narrative. At Modi, copper artifacts appear alongside cruder implements in the same layer, suggesting some communities leapfrogged ahead while others clung to older methods. Was this uneven adoption due to trade networks giving certain groups preferential access to new materials, or did cultural conservatism slow acceptance of innovations in some regions? The answer could rewrite our understanding of how knowledge spread in the ancient world, not as a uniform wave, but as a patchwork of experimentation and resistance. Then there's the contentious issue of external influence. A handful of cylinder seals and pottery shards bearing Mesopotamian motifs have led some to propose a dynastic race theory that foreign invaders jump-started Egypt's transition to statehood. But detractors counter with overwhelming evidence of local development. The gradual evolution of Naqadan pottery styles, homegrown irrigation techniques, and burial practices rooted in Nile Valley traditions. The most compelling middle ground, selective cultural borrowing, where sporadic contact with distant traders introduced fresh ideas without displacing indigenous innovation, like the adoption of the Mesopotamian-inspired niched palace facade architecture, which Egyptians then made distinctly their own. Even climate's role in societal change divides researchers. While sediment cores confirm arid periods around 3,800 BCE, linking drought to collapse assumes these societies were fragile. New pollen studies tell a different story. Shifting diets and settlement patterns reveal remarkable adaptability, with communities pivoting to drought-resistant crops and new water management strategies. Perhaps environmental stress didn't destroy this culture but refined it, forcing innovations that later enabled pharaonic glory. The most fascinating debates swirl around those cryptic symbols some call proto-writing. Are the markings on tomb UJ's tags a true writing system, or merely mnemonics for oral traditions? Advocates for the writing theory note recurring sign combinations that suggest syntactic rules, while skeptics highlight the absence of later hieroglyphic parallels. This isn't just academic quibbling. If these marks encode language, the birth of literacy predates Mesopotamia's claim by centuries, upending the narrative of where civilization began. What makes these disputes so vital is how they mirror archaeology itself, a discipline where certainty is fleeting and every answer breeds new questions. The artifacts haven't changed, but our tools and perspectives have, ensuring that the civilization that left no name will keep challenging us to see the past with fresh eyes. In this scholarly tug of war between competing interpretations, history remains not a static record, but an ongoing conversation, one where even the quietest artifact can shout down decades of assumptions. The story of the Nile's nameless builders isn't unique. It's part of a chorus of early civilizations humming the same tune across distant lands. Half a world away, the Indus Valley was laying bricks for Mohenjo-Daro's grid-planned streets around the same time pre-dynastic Egyptians were experimenting with mudbrick fortifications. Both cultures, never having met, arrived at similar solutions: standardized weights for trade, intricate drainage systems, and a reverence for water that shaped their urban designs. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro mirrors the ritual basins of Hierarchical, not in detail, but in purpose, spaces where the practical and sacred flowed together like converging tributaries. Mesopotamia offers even starker parallels. While Sumerians were pressing cuneiform into clay tablets, Nile communities were etching proto-hieroglyphs onto pottery. Both systems began as accounting tools, marks for tracking grain stores or livestock, before evolving into full-fledged writing. The Uruk expansion, which saw Mesopotamian influence ripple across the Near East, coincides with Nakada Roman II trade boom, suggesting a planetary moment when distant societies simultaneously reached a tipping point of complexity. A lapis lazuli bead from Afghanistan might adorn a Mesopotamian queen's necklace one century and an Egyptian chieftain's grave the next, tracing invisible highways of exchange that stitched continents together. Symbolism reveals deeper connections. The Indus Valley's ubiquitous unicorn motif, often shown alongside ritual feeders, finds an echo in Naqadan art where mythical beasts flank offering tables. Mesopotamian cylinder seals depicting gods taming wild animals resonate with pre-dynastic carvings of humans mastering nature. These shared visual languages hint at universal human preoccupations: the struggle against chaos, the veneration of fertility, the need to impose order on an unpredictable world. Yet the contrasts are as telling as the similarities. While Mesopotamians built ziggurats to scrape the heavens, early Egyptians focused on horizontal sacred spaces like the Nabta Playa stone circles. The Indus Valley's obsession with water sanitation, seen in their advanced sewer systems, has no direct parallel along the Nile, where annual floods naturally cleansed settlements. These differences remind us that cultural evolution wasn't a single road, but a branching maze of possibilities. What binds these civilizations isn't just what they achieved, but how they responded to crisis. When climate shifts dried up the Gaga-Hakra River, Indus cities adapted with water conservation techniques mirroring Egypt's basin irrigation. Mesopotamians facing salinization switched from wheat to barley, just as Naqadan herders diversified crops when deserts expanded. This pattern suggests innovation wasn't merely about brilliance, it was survival instinct distilled through generations. The most profound parallel lies in what didn't survive. Like the pre-dynastic Egyptians, the Indus civilization left no deciphered literature, its script stubbornly silent. Harappan ritual objects, terracotta goddess figurines, bull seals, could almost be cousins to Naqadan artifacts, yet their meanings dissolved with the cultures that created them. This shared silence speaks volumes about history's selectivity, preserving pyramids and temples while erasing the humbler societies that made them possible. Perhaps these echoes across continents point to something fundamental about human societies, faced with similar challenges: feeding growing populations, mediating social tensions, making sense of the cosmos. Our ancestors arrived at eerily comparable solutions. The pre-dynastic Nile, the Indus, and Mesopotamia weren't isolated experiments, but variations on a theme: the human capacity to build worlds from mud and imagination, leaving behind puzzles that still captivate us millennia later. Buried within the familiar tales of gods and pharaohs, there may lie fragments of a much older world, echoes of that nameless civilization preserved not in stone, but in stories passed down through countless generations. Consider the Osiris myth, where a divine king is dismembered, his pieces scattered across Egypt before being miraculously reassembled. This grisly narrative bears striking resemblance to pre-dynastic burial practices discovered at sites like Adama, where bodies were sometimes ritually divided before interment, their bones carefully arranged in symbolic patterns. The green-skinned Osiris, god of resurrection, mirrors the malachite pigments found in early graves, green being the color of rebirth as vegetation returned after the Nile's floods. Could these parallels be coincidence, or are we hearing faint whispers of rituals so ancient they became legend? Other myths hint at even deeper connections. The chaotic god Set, often depicted as a mysterious composite creature, shares uncanny traits with the hybrid figures painted on pre-dynastic pottery, part hippo, part canine, part mythical beast. The celestial cow goddess Hathor, whose star-spangled belly arched over the earth, may descend from early cattle cults evidenced by ceremonial bull burials. Even the Book of the Dead's perilous journey through the underworld finds precedent in Naqadan tomb paintings showing boats ferrying the deceased between realms. These aren't just similar ideas, they're cultural heirlooms, polished by retelling until their origins faded. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from unlikely places. The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, a Middle Kingdom story about a serpent king ruling a magical island, describes a ruler with a beard of lapis lazuli, a mineral Egypt didn't mine but imported from Afghanistan as early as pre-dynastic times. The story's setting, an island that vanishes after the sailor departs, could metaphorically represent the lost homeland of early Nile settlers as rising waters transformed their landscape. Similarly, the Contendings of Horus and Set features gods transforming into hippopotamuses, an animal that appears with startling frequency in pre-dynastic art as both threat and protector. Oral traditions often preserve what archaeology cannot. The Edfu temple texts speak of the followers of Horus, shadowy precursors to the pharaohs who allegedly laid Egypt's sacred foundations. While long dismissed as myth, this account gains new resonance with discoveries like the elite burial at Hierarchies labeled Tomb 100, where a ruler was interred with proto-royal regalia centuries before Narmer's unification. The temple's description of these ancestors building with reeds and mudbrick perfectly matches pre-dynastic architecture, while their alleged mastery of words of power might reference early proto-hieroglyphs. The challenge lies in distinguishing cultural memory from poetic imagination. When Herodotus recorded that Egyptian priests spoke of their civilization's immense antiquity, was he preserving genuine tradition or repeating romanticized boasts? The Dendera temple's zodiac ceiling, though carved in Greco-Roman times, incorporates constellations that align with night skies from 5,000 years earlier, suggesting astronomical knowledge passed down through generations. Even the biblical story of Joseph's 7-year famine finds parallels in sediment cores showing catastrophic droughts around 3,800 BCE. Perhaps the most poignant link between myth and reality lies in the persistent theme of cyclical time, the Egyptian belief that creation periodically renews itself. This worldview mirrors the archaeological record, where pre-dynastic settlements show repeated abandonment and reoccupation as the Nile's channels shifted. The ancient concept of Zep-Tepi, the first time, may encode ancestral memories of that formative era when agriculture took root along the riverbanks. Like palimpsests, these stories were written over many times, but traces of their earliest layers remain, if we know how to look. What emerges is not a neat correspondence between artifact and legend, but something far more fascinating, a dialogue across millennia where history and mythology blur. The civilization that left no name may have ensured its survival the only way possible by embedding its essence into tales so compelling they outlasted empires, waiting for the day when science and storytelling could finally meet halfway. The same sands that preserved pre-dynastic artifacts for millennia now threaten to erase them forever. Across Egypt's deserts, looters' trenches crisscross ancient settlements like scars, their haphazard digging destroying stratigraphic layers that hold irreplaceable context. A single vandalized pot might seem insignificant until you realize its position in the soil could have revealed trade routes. Its residue might have contained traces of long-lost crops, and its markings might have been the missing piece in deciphering early symbol systems. The illicit antiquities trade fuels this destruction, with artifacts ripped from their resting places to vanish into private collections, severing forever their connection to the stories they were meant to tell. But looting isn't the only enemy. Climate change wages a quieter, equally devastating war. Rising groundwater from erratic Nile floods seeps into buried structures, dissolving mudbrick walls that survived 5,000 years of dry heat. At delta sites like Buto, salt intrusion from Mediterranean sea level rise crystallizes on excavated surfaces, slowly crumbling fragile pottery and textiles. Even the desert isn't immune, intensifying sandstorms scour rock art panels at Jebel el-Silsila, blurring images etched when pharaohs were still centuries in the future. These aren't hypothetical threats. At Adama, a cemetery yielding critical insights into early burial customs now battles invasive plant roots splitting bones and displacing grave goods. Urban sprawl adds another layer of pressure. The modern town of Kina expands daily toward the ruins of Nakada, its concrete foundations swallowing the very ground where Flinders Petrie first traced the evolution of pre-dynastic pottery. Farmers plowing fields near Abydos accidentally uncover tombs, their well-meaning but panicked attempts to rebury fragile remains often doing more harm than good. Even well-intentioned tourism poses risks. Foot traffic near Hierarchies' elite tombs erodes fragile sediment layers containing pollen and seeds that could reconstruct ancient diets. Against these converging threats, archaeologists and locals are mounting an ingenious defense. At Hierarchies, a community-led initiative trains villagers as site guardians, equipping them with tablets to document looting attempts in real time. The Abydos Votive Zone project partners with farmers to map subsurface features using ground-penetrating radar before planting, turning agricultural work into an opportunity for discovery rather than destruction. Meanwhile, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities has begun 3D laser scanning vulnerable rock art panels, creating digital backups before the originals fade away. Some of the most promising efforts blend cutting-edge science with traditional knowledge. Near Jebel el-Silsila, conservators working with Nubian stonemasons have revived ancient plaster recipes to stabilize crumbling sandstone carvings. At the Turin Egyptian Museum, multispectral imaging of pre-dynastic textiles has revealed faded patterns invisible to the naked eye, allowing recreations that help local weavers preserve ancestral techniques. Even social media plays a role. The #Save Badari campaign crowdsourced translations of excavation reports into Arabic, making decades of research accessible to the communities living atop these ancient sites. The race to save these fragile links to our past isn't just about preserving objects, it's about safeguarding humanity's collective memory. Every looted grave erases a chapter in the story of how we became who we are. Each flooded settlement takes with it clues about surviving climate volatility that could inform our own responses to environmental change. When local children near Dendera uncover pre-dynastic beads during a school archaeology workshop, they're not just holding artifacts, they're touching the tangible proof that their ancestors shaped history long before the age of pyramids. This isn't a battle that can be won by archaeologists alone. From the farmer who reports strange mounds in his field to the museum visitor whose ticket funds conservation, each of us holds a piece of this puzzle. The civilization that left no name built its legacy in whispers, potsherds, tool marks, and buried seeds. It's our turn to ensure those whispers aren't drowned out by the noise of progress, but amplified for generations still to come. The civilization that left no name may have vanished into the sands of time, but its legacy pulses through history like a heartbeat beneath the skin of Egypt itself. Those anonymous farmers who first harnessed the Nile's floods didn't just irrigate fields, they planted the seeds of empire. The potters who painted spirals on clay vessels weren't just decorating, they were drafting humanity's first visual language. Every stone tool, every grain silo, every reed basket was a quiet revolution, proving that civilization isn't built in grand gestures, but in the accumulated wisdom of generations whose names we'll never know. What's most extraordinary isn't what they left behind, but what they became. The pyramids of Giza didn't spring from the desert fully formed. They were the culmination of centuries of experimentation with mudbrick tombs and celestial alignments. The hieroglyphs adorning temple walls began as simple marks on pottery, scratched by hands that couldn't fathom how far their symbols would travel. Even the mighty pharaohs, for all their divine pretensions, stood on the shoulders of chieftains and shamans who first wove religion and power into the fabric of daily life. This story challenges us to see history differently. We're conditioned to celebrate kings and conquerors, but the truth is far more democratic. The real architects of civilization were the mothers teaching daughters to grind grain, the traders memorizing desert routes, the elders reciting stories that became myths. Their innovations, crop rotation, lunar calendars, communal labor, were so brilliantly practical that they became invisible, like oxygen to those who breathe it. Yet for all we've pieced together, the gaps still tantalize. What songs did they sing while painting those pottery boats? What prayers did they whisper as they buried their dead facing the western stars? The silence holds just enough clues to ignite our curiosity, but not enough to satisfy it, a maddening, beautiful reminder that the past is always partly a mirror, reflecting our own yearning to be remembered. The quest to understand them is far from over. With every satellite image revealing buried settlements, every DNA analysis rewriting migration patterns, we're witnessing a resurrection of sorts. Not of individuals, but of an entire world, one where humans saw themselves as threads in a living tapestry, connected to animals, rivers, and stars. In an age of climate crisis, their hard-won lessons about adaptation and resilience might be their most timely gift. So the next time you hear about ancient Egypt, remember the foundations beneath the glory. The civilization that left no name didn't need monuments to endure. It shaped the very template of what a society could be. And as long as we keep asking questions, digging deeper, and listening to the whispers in the artifacts, they'll never truly be forgotten. If this journey through the echoes of time resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to uncover more mysteries waiting in the shadows of history. Until our next adventure, keep looking backward to see forward.